Welcome to the Establish the Edge podcast. I'm your host, Mike Leone, back with Ben Gretch for part two of the Establish the Edge offseason projections special. Part one, Ben and I went over the NFC South. Today, we're going to go over the AFC South. Before we get into it, make sure you're following Ben at bengretch.substack.com. Also, his podcast with Sean Siegel, Stealing Signals. Great resource for anyone out there in the fantasy football streets, which if you're listening to this us talk through for 80 minutes per division on projections, you're probably pretty into it. But Ben, thanks again for joining me.
Yeah, always a pleasure.
Let's jump right into Jacksonville. I want to start with them because I know we're really hot on this Jacksonville offense overall. And it seems from a team level, we're very in lockstep here. You know, we both got Jacksonville for an above average amount of plays, around 64.5. We've got them around a 62 to 63% pass rate, which is also above average. All this stuff spits out as pretty positive for me for Trevor Lawrence. And we're like very identical, around 4,400 pass yards, 27 pass touchdowns in our projections. For me, this has him as one of the better values out there. And I think he's quite stackable with his receivers. And it's somewhat stunning to me, Ben, that his ADP's dropped 60 spots from last year. I thought he was overvalued last year, but a 60 spot drop when, you know, we didn't see what we wanted to last year, but he's possibly in a better spot this year. I think he ran pretty bad last year. You know, if you look at some of the bad luck metrics out there, he leads them. Still has the pedigree to, I think, be like a pretty good NFL quarterback, and the play calling's in his favor. So, yeah, any thoughts on Lawrence in the pass game here for Jacksonville?
I agree with you that I mean, I didn't come into my projection for Jacksonville particularly high on Trevor Lawrence. His rushing is better than people give him credit for. He comes out well in a projection in that regard, or maybe not people give him credit for, maybe I give him credit for. 334 yards as a rookie, 291 in year two, 339 last year, 11 TDs over the 3 years. Is solid multiple rush TDs each season. 300 plus rush yards and multiple rush TDs is getting you somewhere. I mean, that's not nothing. What I thought was so fascinating, and I also didn't really realize about him, is career high passing is only 25 pass TDs. I had to kind of pull his TDs down a little bit to get more in line with that and the market TD scoring expectations for this offense. But I'm sitting there going like, I'm first of all, I'm projecting him for a career high in pass TDs already. And I also feel like there's upside to where I ended up at with him. He actually comes out for me as the guy that and so far, I haven't finished all my teams yet, but in the teams that I've done so far, he's the quarterback that came out for me where I was like, I think I'm going to need to get a lot more Lawrence after doing the Jacksonville projection.
Yeah. And if you're in the season-long prop streets, the over under for him is only like 20.5 passing touchdowns. And that goes to your point about like, he hasn't put up the amount of passing touchdowns that you'd think. I think a lot of that is some run bad. And I think the over there is pretty compelling in the context that most season long overs are pretty fishy, but I think that one is pretty solid, little bit less injury risk at the quarterback position. So we're both in on Lawrence. Looking at the running back spot, you're a bit more bullish on ETN here with 237 carries, just over 1,000 yards. We're at 217 carries for 890 yards. I think the bigger discrepancies in receiving where you have 15 more targets than we do at 70 and we're at 55. Percentage-wise, that's a bigger discrepancy. So thoughts on ETN's role in the pass game this year?
Well, it's sort of pass game and run game. He was a lot less efficient last year, and the workload did get cold down the stretch, and they've talked about using him a little less this year as a result. But I digging into the some of the advanced metrics, his missed tackles forced per touch was actually up last year, and meaningfully up, even though he went from a 5.2 yards per carry down to a 3.8. His yards after contact per attempt, a little bit down, but not by a lot. Like, he still looks solid in the stuff that he can typically control. And then you look at the other running backs in this game, in this offense, and they were both way worse even than him in yards per carry. He was like 3.8 and they were like 2.8. And it's like, maybe this was just a really bad rushing situation for whatever reason last year in Jacksonville. I tend to think it's probably that it was just a tough spot. As far as the receiving stuff, he's been efficient as a receiver. It's funny, like, people were really certain that Travis Etienne couldn't catch coming out. I don't know if you remember the hyper analysis of his catching form coming out of Clemson. He has catch rates of 80% and 79% in his 2 NFL seasons so far. That's very, very high, even for a running back with the low ADOT. Typically, you're talking about 75 as the average. Getting up to 80 is real strong. His yards per target as a result of that have been above average, have been solid. He's efficient as a receiver. I'm probably a little hot here on his receiving, but Tank Bigsby wasn't great. It sems like he's probably going to be the number 2. Yeah, horrible is a better way of putting it. He's probably going to be the number 2. I didn't project him for much volume. It's the difference for us is not that you guys are projecting a number 2 back. It's more that I'm projecting a few more running back targets, which they haven't typically done. But I think as Lawrence evolves as a passer, the step forward for him, that's one of the things he needs to do better at. He tends to force the ball downfield. He pushes it vertically downfield in a way that's, I think, a positive first mentality trait for a quarterback. But he tends to push it downfield one too many times and then throw the bad pick, as has been kind of the analysis on Lawrence. So I think the step forward for him is getting more comfortable dumping off if he can have like a later, like people are talking about what's his true ceiling after 3 years. I don't think he's done. I think quarterback's a position where you can see guys hit their peak in their 30s sometimes, right? They are accumulating knowledge about how to handle all of these different things that defenses throw at them, and they physically can stay healthier and play longer. It wouldn't be that surprising if he, starts to hit a little bit of a later peak, and he just wasn't that guy right away. One of the steps forward for him, I think, would be more checkdowns and some of that. So maybe I'm running a little hot here. Maybe it's something that's a little bit of a ball knowing take. I feel like that's where things are going to be headed for Lawrence.
So going back to Bigsby, as we mentioned, horrible as a pass catcher, which is obviously good for ETN in terms of keeping him on the field in the right situations. I do have some appeal with Bigsby as just a pure handcuff guy late, because it doesn't seem like there's too much competition behind him. But you do also wonder that, like, ETN goes down, Bigsby takes that role. If he's horrible as a pass catcher, he's not necessarily picking up the passing work. Thoughts as Bigsby as like a late round, handcuff dart throw?
I've definitely taken him because he's free, and I like this offense a little bit. And they're talking about they want him to be the guy. And he gave up the job to Dearness Johnson, but got it back a little bit really late in the season, started to play a little bit more. It seems like they want him to be that dude. They took him relatively high in the draft. They also brought in Keelan Robinson, though, who is the new rookie, and he's a little bit of a pass catcher. So to your point, if ETN goes out, I kind of worry about Bigsby's receiving. I think maybe Keelan Robinson actually factors in at that point on the passing down. He's a little bit of a smaller back, but an intriguing pass catching profile from him, or that would be the expectation of him at the NFL level. So I go back and forth. I don't take a lot of Bigsby, but I have clicked his name because he's so cheap. Seems like a handcuff, like a pure handcuff, like last round. Yeah. But like you don't usually get number 2 backs in the last round. Like it seems like it's an okay move, right? I don't know.
Yeah, that's sort of where I'm at. Last round free, I'll take it. If he starts to move up, probably not super interested.
Right.
Let's go to wide receiver. Christian Kirk, one of my favorites generally, and you've got him at 124 targets. I have 119. We're pretty similar, around 1,000 receiving yards and 80 catches for Kirk. What's interesting is Kirk, like, kind of thought of as like this boring, like he's going to earn targets, but like he's a little bit boring. And I'm looking like he set a career high in yards per catch actually last year at 13.8, second best year of his career in yards per target at 9.3. So pretty strong season. I know it started poorly. It had me capitulating to the Calvin Ridley stands on Twitter after 1 week when Kirk goose-egged week 1, but we came storming back, Ben. We came storming back.
He wound up with a better targets per route run than Ridley and was earning more volume than it was. I mean, it's not just that like, because Ridley was going so much higher than him. Ridley had to be an alpha number 1. It wasn't just that like Kirk was still earning volume. It's like Kirk actually was out targeting him. He was pacing for 120 targets last year. He's been solidly efficient. I look at a depth adjusted racer metric, Josh Hermsmeyer's old, receiver air conversion ratio efficiency metric. He's been strong in that every year when he's been in Jacksonville. He looks good. And part of what happened in this offense after he went down is Evan Ingram got a lot more volume. He ends up having the second most tight end receptions in NFL history with 114. But they run a lot of overlapping stuff, lower ADOT stuff. They go out and replace Ridley with two higher ADOT guys. They get Gabe Davis, who's like a true deep threat. He's efficient after earning the target. His yards per target have always been strong. His touchdown rates have always been strong. But his target rate, especially his targets per out run, and then that kind of stuff has really cratered year after year the last few years. I think that's in part because of how defenses were playing the Bills, taking away the explosives and those things. But he's a true just deep threat. It's all he has. So you can take him away in those regards. But he opens things up, I think, schematically underneath. You have to respect him or they will hit him downfield. And he'll, like I said, after earning the target, be efficient. He'll have a 9+ yards per target and a high TD rate. So defenses have to respect him. And then the other guy is Brian Thomas Jr., who's like even better than him from that perspective. He was a high ADOT guy in college. Some concerns about him in terms of his collegiate yards per route run, targets per both sides of that, yards and targets per route run profiles. He didn't really have strong yards per route run his first 2 years. His third year, it explodes, but not because he was earning more volume. It just explodes because he's massively efficient. He has 17 touchdowns, a bunch of long TDs with Jane Daniels last year, which is all very good. But another guy that's going to really stress defenses vertically, and that all opens things up for Kirk and Ingram underneath. Like, I really like that Kirk and Ingram's heavy volume that you haven't mentioned, and before Kirk goes out, he's getting a lot of work, and he's having one of his best seasons. And then Ingram ends up having the 114 catches, in part because Kirk goes out. All of that underneath work or intermediate work that Lawrence likes to get down to, like, he doesn't get down to the running back targets, but he definitely gets to those guys in the intermediate range. I think that's all going to be there again. I really like both Kirk and Ingram to have a lot of targets.
Yeah, and our first 2 episodes so far feature one team in each episode that is like the team that I'm stacking the most. It was Atlanta, episode 1. Episode 2, so far it's Jacksonville. There's just so many ways for me to be able to get at this stack just because I'm above market on the offense as a whole. Kirk's price tag starting to rise quite a bit on underdog, where like he's a mid 4th round pick now. He's one of my highest exposure receivers, but a lot of that was more when he was like a round 5 guy. I think he's fine where he is, but not like a smash where I thought he was in round 5, just kind of like fine. It's just starting to get a rich price tag, and you're paying the wide receiver tax on Christian Kirk for sure. On other sites, it's still a much more, tolerable price tag. And I think in redraft, he could go under the radar. Brian Thomas and Gabe Davis, though, like, very overweight these 2 receivers too, for different reasons, even though they're both have the potential to be really strong field stretchers, as you mentioned. With Brian Thomas, my take is sort of just like anchored to when I'm aggregating, the people that I trust in terms of like prospect scouting and analysis. Brian Thomas was the wide receiver 4, kind of like close to a tier of his own. Maybe Xavier Worthy in that tier, like prior to the draft. It was, the clear top 3 in Harrison, Adunze, and Neighbors. Then it's Brian Thomas, maybe Xavier Worthy. He gets the draft capital that is aligned with that sort of analysis. He goes to a team where it looks maybe on the surface like there's target competition, but this team really like plays pretty tight. Reminds me like Cincinnati maybe in that regard, where like, they're not playing the wide receiver 4 and 5 a ton.
Right.
If you like Zay Jones, Calvin Ridley, Christian Kirk all had strong target shares last year, and that was with Evan Ingram putting up those ridiculous reception volumes you mentioned. So it seems like he's getting docked for landing spot, and I don't really understand why. So he's been like a kind of an easy click for me. And then with Gabe Davis, I'm happy to see that you've projected him for 88 targets. We're at 81. He's another weird one where, like, on the surface, it's like guy who ran all the routes for Buffalo and couldn't earn targets now goes to a worse team and has more more competition for routes. And it seems like such an easy fade when you frame it that way. But then when you do the projection work, Zay Jones had an 18% target share last year as a wide receiver 3. If you even look at just the games where both Ridley and Kirk played, it was still 15.5%, which is strong. And that's in like taking away all of the contingent value that you potentially have. So I still think his ability to get downfield and score touchdowns is going to play in this offense. So that's why I'm in on basically this whole wide receiver trio.
Yeah, Gabe is the guy that's like, it's fancy cliche to say Gabe Davis sucks, because he's one of those great examples of players that we talk about on this show every year, where he's undervalued right now because he was overvalued in past years and he didn't hit, and then there's an overcorrection. It happens in fantasy. It's human nature. He didn't become the star that everybody wanted him to be, and yet 9.4 yards per target last year, 9.4 the year before, 10.5 the year before, 9.4 the year before, 7.5 plus TD rate every single season, which is like almost double like the wide receiver average. It's very strong. The issue is the lack of target earning, where it just does fall off year over year, the targets per out run. But some of that's probably relative to how teams wanted to play Josh Allen specifically and the Bills specifically. He goes from 18% targets per out run to 16% to 14.1 last year. So each of the last 2 years, a 2 percentage point drop off. And the 18% in his career high in 2021 already wasn't super strong. But to your point, Zay Jones had that target volume at a 14.1 ADOT. His role was the deep threat. So when I projected this out, I had the same thing. And my notes are, I have Gabe taking the high ADOT role Zay had last year, and then Ridley's stuff, which is more combined to all the, it's a high ADOT role as well, but he got more targets across the different depths like we're trying to see. That could maybe go to Brian Thomas Jr. If you want to be in on Brian Thomas Jr., I think you got to say that he's going to be able to earn some volume in the intermediate and shallow range as well, which is, I think, possible. As you were talking through, I'm not in love with the profile because I'm a big target earning consistency guy. He earned targets per out run in college 16%, then 18%, and then last year only 19.3%. Yes, he was sharing the field with Malik Neighbors, but by comparison, some of these other teams that had even like 3 good receivers, we talked about the Huskies receivers on the last show because we're talking about Jalen McMillan. All 3 of them had higher numbers, targets per out run than Brian Thomas last year, at least 2 percentage points higher. Jalen Polk was the lowest of the 3. So even in some of these college offenses that had, a third key guy, the reason Brian Thomas is the player has the profile he is and is a first round pick and all of that stuff and hyped is because after earning the target, he was fantastic last year. 13.5 yards per target. Like I mentioned, had 17 touchdowns, was scoring all of these long TDs. But the concern for me is, can he, if he couldn't do it at the college level necessarily, even though, again, caveat, he was sharing the field with Malik Neighbors, can he go to the NFL and earn volume in a huge way at all depths? That's where I'm a little concerned about him. I don't wind up taking him a ton because I do think Kirk and Ingram are ingrained enough, and they've shown that in this offense. But I do think there's upside for Brian Thomas from a role perspective. They took him in the first round. They probably want him to be that alpha that can do everything like they were trying to do with Ridley last year. But yeah, I mean, both him, Gabe, certainly Ingram, Kirk, they're all intriguing guys in this pass game. I completely agree with you. Thomas is the one I don't love being out on because he's a rookie, but he's the one I tend to get the least of because he's pretty pricey. He's sliding a little bit. I take him when he slides into the 7th. Tougher for me in the 6th. But Gabe Davis, I agree with you. Like outside the wide receiver window, you start to get the double-digit rounds. I mean, the high ADOT role that Zay Jones had last year, it's there for him. There's a lot of opportunity here. Kirk.
He's also like he is a legitimately better in best ball player too. If you're talking about best ball versus redraft, like redraft always gonna be tough to know when to start. Like if he can be relied upon, probably never gonna break out in that target earning way. But in best ball, I mean, the ability to get like 4, 5, 20+ point weeks over the course of the season is
a great point. This part of the reason why people hate Gabe Davis so much right now, especially at this point in time, you go look at his game log. He had like 5 20-point games in PPR last year, and they were every 3rd week like clockwork, which meant after 2 bad games, no one was starting him in season-long leagues for his 20-point game. And then they'd put him in the next week, and then he would go. He had like a goose egg after a 20-point game twice, I think. I mean, people were putting him in their lineup for the goose egg. How maddening.
I remember doing this stat with Shamili with Dink, and we were at a certain point where the season where we're like, he has 4 20+ point games, and he's averaging 11 points per game on the season. It's like impossible. But you moved to Ingram. We're pretty similar here. We have 113 targets. You have 124. We talked about in the initial episode, Ben's numbers were a little bit hotter than ours in terms of like some health assumptions and something. We're generally projecting teams at like 105% target share and scaling down to 100 just to be a little bit more conservative. So that spits out nearly 200 PPR points. This is a guy that I think sometimes people don't fully grasp. In the tight ends, there's a few of these guys with like honestly been like really big discrepancies between like their underdog half PPR scoring and their like FFPC tight end premium scoring. Like you look at like George Kittle in terms of reception volume versus Evan Ingram. Like these guys can swing pretty wildly in terms of their upside between formats. They can both play very nicely in all formats, but just wanted to point that out and just curious how you view Ingram. There's been a lot of talk about elite tight ends on underdog, and generally I think the marker's been like Pitts and Kittle as 6 and 7, and Ingram's sort of been the guy that's like teetering just outside that, and how you view him.
It's so tricky. I don't think he's a part of the elite tight ends. I think the elite tight ends are the top 7, these profiles that could be really efficient. Ingram doesn't show that kind of efficiency. Like Pitts and Kittle could just be like so much better in terms of like yard per reception and all that stuff that could really lead to big yardage numbers and those types of things if things break their way. Ingram's more of a pure volume play, and we just talked about how Kirk missing time last year and only playing like 10 or 12 games or whatever it was opened up him for a little bit more of that volume. And that's probably not going to be the case again this year. Plus, he's not hyper efficient. He's a low ADOT guy, doesn't add a ton after the catch, doesn't tend to score a ton of touchdowns. And so like he's priced not far behind Kittle, and I often don't take him because of that. I'm like, oh, that's a tiered break. And yet, like, I want to have Ingram. I want to have some Ingram. Like, it doesn't make like he's going to get a lot of targets. He's going to be good. It's a really high floor, comfy play, especially in tight end premium, like you said. When I start doing a lot more FFPC stuff, I'm going to be, especially if I miss out on those, that tight end window that I like to be in the first 7 tight ends. But if I miss out on it, like, what are your options? Keep waiting. I mean, you might as well just take Ingram at that price. I think he's a good pick. At that point.
I feel like he too is. This is anecdotal, but feels like he's had like a wider range in my drafts of where he goes. Where sometimes he's available like a full round after ADP, where like half the room has a tight end already, and someone like, and I've taken some double early tight end teams with the Evan Ingram faller as like my second tight end in some of these rooms, especially on FFPC. I think when you can legitimately start these guys in the flex, there's more flex spots and it's tight end premium. But even on underdog, I've had that happen to me where it's like, okay, I got Kittle, and then so I pass, at the 6-7 turn or whatever on Ingram, and he falls back somehow, and I'm okay taking him.
The last one I want to throw on the Jags, I gave kind of a bull case on Brian Thomas. I will say it worries me that I've been down on him. And for anyone who, like you were saying, most people are higher on it. I seem to be the low guy in the industry on Thomas. I'm not finding a lot of people that are buying what I'm selling on that bull case. So, I mean, bear case. I'm saying, I mean,
there's a low guy in the industry, but
really,
I mean, well, there's been a lot of Keon Coleman FUD lately, but for a while, like he's going after guys that are, he's going after Xavier Worthy, he's going after Ladd McConkey, he's going after, he's not going after Keon Coleman anymore, but I guess I do that.
I said really so quickly because I was like, who's going to be at the Brian Thomas support group when he scores 3 touchdowns week 1?
I think the difference is a lot of the market maybe is fearful of the landing spot for some odd reasons. And yours more like a prospect take coming in.
Profile.
So, and that's the perspective difference where I'm like, oh, he was the clear wide receiver 4 prospect. He got drafted there. This actually isn't a bad landing spot. Like, I am not going to draft Ladd McConkey over Brian Thomas. Whereas if you had more questions over the prospect profile, then it, to me, is a more logical bear argument against him than it is like a weird, like, I don't like the landing spot, but I haven't really heard a good argument for not liking the landing spot.
Yeah, no, the spot is fine. I like the way you put that, where it's sometimes we talk about target concentration when it's like the top 2 guys get everything. Sometimes it's the top 4 get everything, and it's no one else beyond that. And it's a different type of concentration, but it's still meaningful. And for a high efficiency player like Thomas, for an athletic guy who can put up big TD rates, he doesn't need to be a 150 target player. So this type of offense is a nice fit for him. He should get a comfortable top 4 role. And then this offense is, very concentrated to the top 4. Yeah, this is just a player for me, just to like really put a bow on my take, where I'm telling the listeners not to follow me in my opinion. Like I feel like I'm going to regret what I'm doing, but I'm pretty much fading him, and I don't want anyone to go down with me.
Yeah, that's interesting. For me, it seems like a rookie wide receiver that's been easier to get exposure to than the other ones. So we'll see how that plays out. Let's go over to Houston, where you've got them bumping up a decent bit in terms of plays per game, up to 65.2. We've increased that a little bit to 64. They were at 63.7 last season. One area where we've both kind of projected some bumps is in pass rate. We've got them at 61.8%, which is a small bump, but it's a little bump. You've got them at 62%. They were at, I believe, 61.2%. So those are small bumps, but I also think like their game script situations might be a little bit better this year. So from a PROE perspective, it might be a bigger bump than it looks like on paper. Mm-hmm. I think the big CJ Stroud bull case is that with the addition of Stephon Diggs, year 2 for him, they hand over the keys and they just let him throw a lot more than he did last year. I feel confident that there's going to be a little bit of that. I'm somewhat skeptical that it'll be like a huge change like we've seen with like Joe Burrow or stuff at times, just because it's such like a downfield efficient passing offense. I don't know if it's necessarily one that's going to be like all of a sudden a ton of volume, but I'm curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, this is a really interesting one. And then we're going to get to Indy as well, which is another second-year quarterback. And everyone talks about Steichen's pace, and I think that will be a really interesting one as well. And these two quarterbacks go so close. Stroud's been falling a little bit, but the Richardson-Stroud conversation will be a fun one for this episode for a variety of reasons. The reason I went higher on pace here, and I'm actually a little lower, I think, than most people would be on Indy's pace, so we'll get into those. But here, I'm looking at recent breakout teams in the next season and seeing, for the most part, we're getting a secondary bump in play vol or pass rate. So like Buffalo in 2021, Cincinnati in 2022 when Burrow was healthy, the Eagles in 2023. I wrote like your mileage may vary. You got to kind of look at it a certain way I don't have all those numbers right in front of me to get to that, but I think it's like anecdotally it fits what I want to believe. So maybe it's a little bit more confirmation bias, but it's like this team was really good the first year, and the next year they know what they are and they're more comfortable leaning into that. Whereas like Stroud, you go look at like his game log last year, he did have some games where it was pretty low volume still. I would also note Kansas City and Baltimore. It was 2 years for both of them later, but they both had high play volume seasons 2 years after that first MVP year for Mahomes and Lamar, which were the breakout seasons. It wasn't the very next year, but it was 2 years later. But this sort of post breakout bump in team, like we're now an elite team and we play fast and we score points and we throw. I also think, again, anecdotally, this is not one I dug into, but you'd probably find similar about acquiring a wide receiver like Stephon Diggs. Certainly we saw that when the Bills acquired Stephon Diggs, that those teams tend to pass more. It's an interesting one to think through, because I think the Texans are a team that could just be the defining team of this season. Earlier in the offseason over at Stealing Lions, my sports betting thing, I took them as a Super Bowl prop play for our guys over there, because this is before the Stephon Diggs thing, but because they're in the rookie QB contract window and they had the ability to acquire a lot of talent. They did so on defense as well. They got Danielle Hunter, Danico Autry, Aziz Al-Shaair, 3 front 7 guys that are going to help they already had the defensive rookie of the year and Will Anderson, a defensive end. I think they're going to actually have a really good front 7 this year. It looks like on paper. Their secondary is maybe a little bit shaky, which might mean they lean into a lot of shootouts, which would be kind of interesting. But I think they're actually a really good contender in the AFC, that they might even be ahead of your Bills now as the second best, contender to the Chiefs, because you get such a bump from this rookie QB window. It's kind of like when Burrow was a rookie, in his rookie QB contract window, was able to take the Bengals straight, like bypass the Bills and the Ravens and go straight to the AFC Championship 2 years in a row. And ultimately go to the Super Bowl one year. That's, I think, where the Texans are when you think about the multi-year thing. What was that?
I just wondering if the Bills could ever get Patrick Mahomes to play against them in the playoffs like he did against the Bengals in the playoffs. Like
It would be
just
nice.
one time.
It would be nice. He seems to play perfect against the Bills. But yeah, no, I mean, the other thing that I do think about when you think about these multi-year things, like the Chiefs right now in their run and the Bills right now are kind of resetting. Those teams are like, we're going to make the playoffs. We're thinking about the playoffs. We're not trying to put up break records in the regular season. The Chiefs talked about this with like Travis Kelce not running as many routes last year. Like they're planning for the postseason. The Bills are not stretching their legs and seeing what they are offensively. The Texans are going into year 2 of what they like. This is the year they stretch their legs and CJ Stroud throws for 5,000 yards. Like if you want to get like, again, anecdotal about it all, but it does feel like this could be a really aggressive year for the Texans. The market obviously believes this too. They're really high on all 3 receivers. This isn't like, some novel take, but I did think it was interesting.
But it isn't. I mean, it's interesting to know the extent of it because you've obviously got expensive price tags. I know I've mostly been out on CJ Stroud unless I get him really falling, but he's started to fall on our ADP, market. We're recording this on July 3rd, probably more released, a week from now. But as of this week, he was the biggest faller inside the top 100, going from an ADP of 60 to 66, 61 to 66. And now you're starting to get into a territory where I think he's a little bit more draftable, especially if you would have had to take a Houston wide receiver before it. But knowing Stroud's cost will to a certain extent impact what you're going to do with the Houston wide receivers, I think, earlier, because there's some value in getting that stack and you don't necessarily want to have to take Stroud at pick 60, but now he's ADP at 66 and maybe you get him at 70, 72 more. I'm more into it. I still think he's a little overvalued just relative to like where Burrow and Dak go, who to me, like, I think are somewhat similar in terms of their potential to put up like a huge passing season, but Stroud might have a little, and I give Stroud the edge over these guys, but just in terms of cost, you're talking 3 rounds later. As
Right.
that shrinks to like 2 rounds, 1.5 rounds, then Stroud becomes, a much
It's
better bet.
undeniable at his cost, he has to have a pretty legendary passing season. He's not a mobile quarterback. He's got to throw for 5,000 yards and 40, if not close to 50 touchdowns, which it's harder for quarterbacks to do in the modern NFL than, when Mahomes did that in his second season or Peyton Manning did that in 2013, the 5,050 seasons. There's only been 2 in NFL history. I think the bull case for Stroud is like, look, dude, he's got Nico Collins had a 3+ yards per out run last year. Tank Dell had a 2+ yards per out run. When I did this projection and went through their passing game, like I had to nuke efficiency a ton. And I still was like, I mean, I projected him for 5,000 passing yards, Mike. Like I was like, it feels a little crazy, but I have Nico at 1178, Diggs at 1083, Tank at 963. And pretty quick, you got 3 guys around 1,000 receiving yards. You're pretty quick. You're pushing 5,000 passing yards when you get the rest of the team in there. So it's a tough one
pretty
to
crazy.
figure out.
And then we go to running back where we get one of these conflicting situations with a running back like Joe Mixon, who typically like kind of like a dead zone running back where you're like, is he that talented? Do I want to take him here? But he finds himself yet again attached to a really good offense with very little competition and some decent investment in him. And he's someone that I've been sort of overlooking the talent side of things and taking him. You're kind of like our first episode, we talked about Rachaad White, and I was more in on him than Ben, but being able to take him as like a hero RB build almost in like the 5th, 6th round. Joe Mixon has, an early 6th round ADP right now. So that's been one that I've been clicking a decent bit in round 6 on Underdog. And again, I think a little bit better in best ball where those assured running back points maybe matter a little bit more than the huge ceiling. But yeah, just not a lot of competition on an offense that looks very unlikely to not be above average in some capacity.
Right. And I mean, Dameon Pierce was really bad in this run system last year, kind of change of offense, didn't fit him well. I'm thinking about taking him late and then never actually clicking because I'm like, this is the situation where the guy that, again, the fantasy community likes, but maybe isn't actually thought of that way within the building. He was a day 3 pick that the last regime took, and or this coaching staff, at least. I don't know if it's the same executives, but regardless, like, this is the guy that could just be like surprisingly cut. It feels like, you know what I mean? Like right now on paper, it's like, he's the handcuff. But what that means for me, back to Mixon, is that almost by default, like, has to get a ton of work. And he's never actually been like a huge every down guy with the Bengals, but they traded for him and then they extended him. I think it's really hard not to like Mixon's price. I've never really been in on him as a talent. I do take a little of him. We talked about Rachaad White on the last episode, and I don't usually ever take White because I'm so concerned about the efficiency. But with Mixon, it's like I'm concerned about the efficiency, but I don't see any threats to his role with that contract and everything else. And I feel so good about the offense. I can't not have some of it.
Yeah, I'm with you. I like Mixon more than White. I've started to take some Dameon Pierce because I'm falling into that trap a little bit of like, we keep expecting something to happen and it hasn't. And the more it doesn't, we're like, well, I guess I'll take Dameon Pierce RB2 in round 17, like if I need to stash RBs, but feel similarly to you. It's not one that I'm running to. I'm a little scared that we still see something happen there in terms of the depth behind Mixon. Let's go to the receivers where, I'll rant a little bit about, like, I kind of hate sometimes the question of like, can a QB support this many pass catchers with this price tag, or like either the wide receivers are mispriced or QBs mispriced. And sometimes I feel like that's not the best way to look at things because the way that players score points matters so much, the way it's concentrated. And in terms of making these wide receiver bets too, Ben, like the contingent value matters a lot in addition to the base role. So it's like, yeah, if all three of them are healthy, and maybe they're not all three are going to be ADP, but if one is a league winner and two are fine, like that's okay. So I sometimes hate the framing of the question of like, if a quarterback can support the ADPs of all the players, I think it might miss the point a little bit. And right now, where we have it relative to market, we're highest on Tank Dell, but I'll go through our projections here. For Nico Collins, we're at just under 1,100 yards. You're closer to 1,200 yards, splitting the difference somewhere between like 6 to 7 touchdowns for him. Tank Dell, we're both just over 100 targets, just under 1,000 yards, around 6 touchdowns. Stephon Diggs, around 120 targets, around 1,000 yards. And again, that's 6 to 7 touchdown marker. So like pretty similar stuff. It's a really difficult room to assess. You hit on the Nico Collins yards per route run was so absurd last year. But then, like, I know from DFS before Dell got hurt, we were projecting Dell higher than Nico. So it's like,
right.
Nico's got a better sample size of being amazing, and we should lean into that, which is why he goes first, and I think is right. But it is interesting that Dell was already as a rookie halfway through the season projecting a little bit better on a weekly basis. And then Diggs, I almost feel like it's the nut landing spot for him. Like, I think some people don't because of the competition, but I'm just looking at like, wow, like there's stress taken off him where he like maybe isn't as good downfield as he used to be. He's in an offense that's going to be really good. He can kind of play from the slot now. Like, I think this is really good for him, even though the huge target seasons that he had with Buffalo are a little bit off the table.
Yeah. But I mean, the fascinating thing for me is in trying to parse like how this works. I've heard a lot of the different takes, and a lot of it has been anti-Diggs. It's been like he's going to be the third receiver. I have I love to reference targets per out run stuff, and then I have a weighted targets per out run that layers in some ADOT stuff. It emphasizes the targets over the air yards, but layers that in a little bit. Diggs has been so consistent in that stat. Or his 4 years in Buffalo, 0.67, 0.65, 0.69, 0.69. For reference, Nico was 0.68 last year. Tank Dell was 0.66. They were both just shy of Diggs, and they were in the same offense. But one of the really important reference points for understanding what Nico and Tank did last year is that Robert Woods actually was right there with Nico for the most routes in this offense last year and was, unfortunately, really bad. He was at 17% targets per route run, 6 yards per target. His yards per route run had fallen all the way to 1.02, which just 2 years prior, he was like a 1.74, 1.60, like closer to 2. In his peak, he was a 2+ yards per route run guy. He was half of that last year. They were just really, really empty routes. I view that as part of why Noah Brown had a career high targets per out run and had all those splash games as well. Not all those. He had a couple splash games, but he, in a sample of about 300 routes, has almost a 2 yards per route run. Never really did anything close to that on any meaningful route sample prior, because it's one of those things where if the other guy running routes is unfortunately on his last legs, and Robert Woods probably is done at this point, it opens up more volume to come to you, basically, because it's not going to go there. So Nico, the interesting thing about him, he starts at 16.3 targets per out run, 22%, then 26%. He takes these gains in his 3 years. His ADOT has been consistently above average. His efficiency really broke out last year. And so you see him take these steps forward. And last year, the yards per out run really spikes. The Tank thing is really interesting. That Tank was better than Nico prior to that. The way I look at that is after Tank got hurt, Nico really showed us that even as the true number one and getting more defensive attention, he was like very, very good. And I mean, like you said, it's a larger sample that he was even better over more time. It's really hard to parse all this, but with Diggs coming over and still showing the ability to consistently earn volume. And I'll note, like I was talking about Nico's progression. Diggs from year one of his career was at least 0.5 weighted targets per out run. I mentioned Nico as a rookie was 0.43. 0.5, and he's never been lower than that. Year two, he was 0.55. He was in the 0.6s while still in Minnesota. He's been strong his whole career. He's not super old. Last year, his yards per target fell, and late season after the Joe Brady takeover at the offensive coordinator, the ADOT fell a little bit. The role was a little bit different for him, but he still earned volume like an alpha. And I've heard other people say that Diggs is going to be a cancer. That's not the way Diggs was when he came over to Buffalo, man. Like, yeah, he can be a little bit of a prima donna, but when he's in a situation where he feels like, he has something to prove, he's usually locked it up. He was a problem in Minnesota later in his career in Minnesota, and then he was a great teammate early in Buffalo, and then he became a little bit of a prima donna. They trade him to Houston. Houston and him agree to restructure him to a short-term 1-year deal where he's like looking for his next contract after that. My perception of it is Diggs is going to be the consummate professional at this point. Like, he's shown that like ability to do that. We're seeing no drama from him off the field this offseason. And the guy still was earning volume last year. It's just more of a question of whether the efficiency can still be there for him. It's a really tricky situation to parse, but I do think people are underweighting. The market is underweighting as Diggs starts to fall. The potential that Diggs comes in and is just the alpha, which I don't think is likely, but I think is possible. Because as I said, Nico kind of had to build up to that. And maybe Nico and Tank were brought along by Stroud a little bit and by these empty Robert Woods routes last year. More likely in the way that I'm playing it, I am projecting Nico to be better. I'm going to rank Nico higher. I'm going to have Diggs second, though. I've seen some people saying that Tank should go ahead of Diggs. I do think Tank, with the size concerns, I think he's really good and a great fit for the offense. I want to be drafting him as well. I agree with you that the idea that all three of these guys can't have high ADOTs is just wrong, because you have the contingent upside as well. I mean, if anyone misses time, the other two are going to smash. How efficient Nico and Tank were last year speaks so favorably to what Stroud can do for them, for all three of them. I'm really in on all three. I've drafted all three. I know they're pricey, but it's a pass game I want pieces of. It's difficult to parse. I do think that Diggs and Nico are the most likely sort of alphas in terms of the ways that they earn volume, and Tank is sort of like, feels like he's going to get his target share pushed down a little bit into that number 3 role that's high efficiency off of that, right? Like, I think he's going to smash too and be a splash play guy, but just less consistent. I think he's more of a guy who works off of that schematically. It'll be really, really interesting. I do think the market has it right, to be clear, where Nico's the number 1, Diggs is second right now, and Tank's third.
Yeah, we have it pretty similarly. We do have Dell slightly ahead of Diggs in the half PPR scoring, but then Diggs ahead of Dell in the full PPR scoring, but very close to one another in both. And overall, seen it very similarly. Noah Brown's a guy that's interesting too in the very back end of drafts. We generally aren't drafting like wide receiver handcuffs for contingent value. We do it with running back all the time. I think Noah Brown's kind of an exception where this offense is so powerful, and he was so good when he filled in last year that if any of 3 guys go down, it's probably going to be him. I know there's a little bit of Mechie hype, but there was last year too. I'm not totally buying it. We think Robert Woods could, get cut here. So yeah, did want to know. I think Noah Brown is a guy that's very easy to overlook in the last round because your base projection is going to be almost nothing because he's not going to play ahead of these guys, but some good contingent value.
I love that take. I've never even considered this, but I think it's a great take.
Shout
Just
out
kind of like
Levitan.
saying
He's
that
been on
Stroud's
that.
going to elevate the efficiency of everyone. I mean, it's a great point. If he gets some routes, somebody gets hurt. I mean, he was good last year.
Let's talk about Schultz. That's the one where we differ on the most. We were just a little concerned with Diggs coming over, like where the volume comes from, and we ended up taking it from Schultz a little bit. So we're only at 71 targets. You're at 92. So that's one where we have the biggest discrepancy in half PPR, full PPR scoring. It comes out to about 30 to 40 fantasy points. So I wanted to hear your take on Dalton Schultz.
Well, and I'm kind of curious as well. I guess I have the backup tight ends for less because I actually have brought down their overall tight end target share a little bit and bumped the wide receiver target share collectively, which you would expect, obviously, with the addition of Diggs, that more targets would go directly to the receivers. I guess I'm on one. I don't actually feel strongly about Schultz, and I see this projection for you, and I'm like, oh, that's probably what I should be considering is that outcome for Schultz because he's never been a big target earner. Last year, he even in the situation where Robert Woods was this corpse running routes out there, and it was great for Noah Brown to set a career high, and it was great for Nico Collins to break out to career highs, and it was great for Tank Dell to have a great rookie year. Schultz was basically just at like his best, even par with his best year from Dallas. Like nothing exciting, nothing new. And he theoretically would be operating in similar depths to Robert Woods and would be a guy that you would have actually expected to maybe have had a good year if everyone else is peaking for that reason. So I think you're actually he's not really a target earner. He's a routes guy, right? We talked about this on the last show with Kate Otten. Like that's what he was in Dallas. That's what he's been here. I think he's a guy that's going to run a lot of routes and have a little bit of a floor of production. And it's a good passing game, so he can score some touchdowns probably. But you guys projecting him for only 71 targets definitely raises an eyebrow for me in a way that I'm like, yeah, that's a real outcome for Dalton Schultz, where he's just falling off quite a bit to make room for three good receivers to be the guys.
Yeah. I'd probably looking at this, split the difference a little bit, maybe get him around 80 targets. We might end up there, which would make him pretty neutral at ADP, but definitely someone I'd be willing to reach on if I had CJ Stroud, to complete the stack and just hope kind of the offense just goes nuke in general. Let's go to Tennessee, and they're a team with Ryan Callahan coming over from Cincinnati that we're expecting them to throw a good bit more than they did last year. I'm trying to look at the notes that we have. But yeah, we're expecting a pretty big increase in pass rate. And it looks like you are too. You actually have it a little bit higher. We're both low on plays for them still, around 61. But I've got a 61.5% pass rate. You've got a 62% pass rate. That's definitely a bump from what we've seen in past years.
Yeah, and I mean, the offensive coordinator was a pass game coordinator for Jacksonville last year, but I mean, that's kind of a scary note for me because they didn't really integrate Ridley very well in that pass game that was mostly not that exciting, giving the talent last year. His other NFL experience was with the Raiders a little while back. Callahan does have a solid background, but the roster also isn't very strong. And I don't know, I'm kind of concerned, but I do think they could pass more. But my overall takeaway with the Titans is this team might just suck. Mike Vrabel, I think, was actually a pretty good coach, probably better than people thought. I think covered up some warts, got some more wins out of these teams through small edges. It's an interesting one. I'm curious if you're playing Will Levis at all, for example.
I am a little bit. I think they could suck, but I think they could suck in a more fun way. It's just obviously you need a base level of competency from Levis for that to even matter. And that is what I'm most concerned about. But yeah, you're obviously a little bit concerned about the receivers too. Ridley, I think, is overrated. Hopkins is aging, and Burks never really developed into anything, and we're not sure what they're going to do at tight end. So there's concerns, but it's cheap enough that I'm buying. I have a decent amount of Hopkins, which we'll get to in a little bit. Levis isn't a skeleton key guy for me. I have less of him than I do. We talked about a lot of backdoor stack stuff in the first episode of NFC South. I have less Levis than I do like Baker and probably even Derek Carr, just the way things work out. But I do have some, kind of a
I don't think
carve-out.
I've drafted him yet. He had the 4 touchdowns in his first start. He started 8 more games and had 4 more touchdowns across those 8 with 4 interceptions. He was good late in the Miami game. I've seen that brought up that they came from behind and won, but he still didn't wind up with a huge fantasy game. It was like 18, underdog points or something. It was like all right because he wasn't doing much up to that point in that game, and typically wasn't in a lot of these games. He threw for sub 200 yards in 4 of the games that he started and made it through the whole game. Like even the game he threw for the 4 touchdowns, his first start was only 238 yards. And there was a couple long TDs in that game, but there was just like nothing else. Like he's not.
There's but that's where you're hoping some of the volume comes in and can boost that. And you lose Derrick Henry, who's like one of those RBs I do think probably somewhat meaningfully changes the play calling, by the goal line and overall. But I don't know. Again, I'm not like super bullish. We both got him for around 4,000 yards, low 20s pass touchdowns. Nothing crazy, but I think there's a hint of upside and uncertainty here, I guess, versus like some of these late round quarterbacks where there's really like, nothing in the upside department. We'll come back to the receivers, but at running back, we both have a pretty close split between Pollard and Spears, with Pollard, slightly ahead in rush attempts, but we both have Spears a little bit ahead in the receiving game, and it kind of nets out to very similar fantasy point projections for both of these backs. And Spears right now is the cheaper one. I think he has arguably the better breakout profile too. I mean, he probably does as being the younger year 2 guy. Pollard coming off a really disappointing efficiency season. The pro for Pollard would just be like he did look better towards the end of the season, as we kind of maybe underrated preseason last year what his previous injury did to him coming into the 2023 season. And I do think he probably has a leg up for that base workload than Spears. So got them ranked pretty similarly, but Spears is at the better cost right now.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm maybe going to regret it, but I'm not taking a lot of Titans at all because I think this team might suck out loud.
Mm-hmm.
So it's tough for me with the running backs. I think Spears is good. This is wild that we both have it so close, where we both have Pollard within, in the 170s in rush attempts, Spears in the 150s, but Spears about 5 targets more. And like you said, it nets out to very close projections for both backs, and also across, yours and my projections for each back is close. I think Spears is the bigger, probably efficiency spike potential, like does some things on his own at this point, like Pollard used to be. But when we start to see that dip in a 25 plus running back, the efficiency, the explosive plays, it's tough to count on to swing back around positively. So that's the issue for me for Pollard. But Spears, as a young guy, showed that last year, showed some explosiveness, and is the one that I like more as well.
Yeah, and I should know. I'm looking at my exposures through like about 35 drafts on Underdog, and I'm underweight basically every single tight end. So we're not that far. I think I see maybe a little bit more upside, but like overall, I think these guys are overvalued. The one that I like most is Hopkins, but his price has also like increased a little bit where I'm not getting him as much. For a while there, I just thought there was such a mispricing between Hopkins and Calvin Ridley that he was a very good deal. Right now, it's more that like I think Hopkins is closer to fairly priced and Ridley's still overpriced. So I do want to talk about how you view these wide receivers, because I have a tough that you've got them each at 112 targets. We've got Hopkins for 116, Ridley for 108. Pretty similar, leaning Hopkins. But I felt like I honestly had to stretch myself to even get it that tight. Looking at, historically Hopkins, I know he's older, but like pretty big target earner. We've seen some ability for him to earn massive target shares. And he was better than Calvin Ridley last year, like pretty meaningfully across like most metrics. I think the raw stats make it look close, but that had more to do with team level stuff than it did with how these two actually played when you break down like the per route run metrics. So, and Ridley, I think, he's what, 29 and Hopkins is 31. So this age gap might feel wider than it actually is.
It really doesn't make any sense. I mean, Hopkins had posted 4 seasons in recent years with targets per out run in this 24.5 to 26% range, which is good, alpha numbers. But last year was actually his highest figure since 2017. He got up to 26.3%, added decent enough efficiency, 2+ yards per route run. His first year over 2.0 since 2020. He does turn 32, or he just turned 32 in June, actually. But
32.
But I'm still I'm like you said, far more confident in his overall ability than Ridley's, even with the concerns about an age cliff. If you go look at Ridley's career, he's just not the alpha that he's sort of billed as. He has one really strong target earning season. And then the next year he was starting off well, but got suspended after like 5 games in terms of earning volume. Prior to that, he was sort of the number 2 alongside Julio and was more of an efficiency player on a lower targets per route run. And then last year, that's what he looked like, except for he didn't even have the real efficiency, but he was back in the like 20% targets per route run range. He really legitimately has one season in his career. And I know, yes, he missed a whole season to the sports betting thing in the middle of his prime, but one season where he had like that 24%ish, 25%ish range that I just said that Hopkins has been doing basically every season of his career. And
right.
Some of that's not because of Hopkins not having a lot of competition, but yeah, I mean, I put him, I'll be honest with you, I put him with the same targets rates because Ridley's going higher. And I immediately was like, okay, this is good enough. It's going to make Hopkins look better relative to ADP and Ridley look worse. But you guys are like exactly right. And it's how I would really do it. If the ADPs were flipped, I would have a bigger gap here. I would have Hopkins leading because his profile is an alpha profile that earns volume and has been up until last year, and Ridley's is just not.
Yeah, I talked to Crane about this. He's in lockstep with us too. I know I had asked you on a stream, like, are you worried that like Kyle Pitts has like some Juju Smith-Schuster in him where it's like early breakout, then like a couple of so years with an injury in there, and we're good with Pitts, which we talked about Pitts extensively on the first episode. But then I'm like, Ridley's the Juju, right? Like he's the guy that has like the one really good year, and it's like 4 years ago now, and so he's one of my hardest fades. I don't think I have any Ridley, and I don't take a lot of I'm pretty open to drafting everyone in best ball. I have no Ridley thus far.
Just to emphasize the Hopkins targets per out run stuff, I said he did it at a really high ADOT last year, where I've mentioned the weighted targets per out run stat a couple times. He was tied for second in the league last year with Devontae Adams per route run. They didn't throw a ton. He didn't run a ton of routes, but Tyreek Hill dominated this stat and led the league. And DeAndre Hopkins and Devontae Adams were tied for second, just above some of the young, exciting receivers. I mean, he got a lot of volume per route last year. It's not like this isn't like we're hanging on to a guy who's aging. He was still, I mean, the efficiency stuff I'm a little bit more concerned with, but he's also the incumbent and had some big plays with Levis, and Levis has played with him. And we know receivers that change teams often need a little bit of time to integrate, or just often just fail to hit expectations. Ridley's price makes no sense. I just have such a hard time with it. It makes no sense.
Yeah, I'm with you. We can do receiver 3 and 4 pretty quickly. Just like any takes on Boyd, Burks, like any situations where you're drafting them, or.
I mean, Boyd's one of the other reasons I'm like, I'm worried about this team because he hasn't been great in the last couple of years. He's been aging, but Callahan brings him over from Cincinnati. I think he's going to play him more than is probably warranted at this stage of his career. Like if Ridley's not very good, and especially like if Hopkins were to have some injury issues, like who's going to catch passes in this game, in this passing game suddenly? It's just, yeah, it's not good.
Let's go to tight end. One of the guys we've been higher on most of the offseason as a late round tight end is Chig Okonkwo, where again, just not a lot of upside late in tight ends. And I do like a young athletic tight end. Sometimes they take some time to break out. So we're pretty in on him, but hearing some hype about Josh Weil, and I know like Crane's got some stuff where like when the tight end doesn't play the blocking downs, he's in for like some of the play action stuff that's highly valuable. So starting to get a little trigger shy. See, you have him at 70 targets. We're at 60 targets. That makes me feel a little bit better about continuing to, kind of take my shot here late. So thoughts on Chig versus Weil?
I'm not really actually drafting him. I just, I'm projecting him for it's probably just, pessimism in the receivers to a certain degree that I gave him a little bit more target share.
Got it. So I guess my summation on Chig would be I'm still drafting him late because I think there's more upside than other tight ends, but this could go very bad very easily, I think, too.
I like that take, though. I mean, it's like we were just talking about, if the receivers aren't good and then he has the potential to be, I know there's good work in the fantasy industry where a lot of the later round breakout tight ends are guys who can be like a top 2 target earner in their offense. Like that could happen here if one of Ridley or Hopkins misses time or is just not good anymore. There's room for him to be one of the key guys in the passing game. So, yeah, I mean, I don't hate the take at all. I just haven't really taken a lot of them.
Okay, let's go to the Colts. And this is one where we do have some discrepancy in the play calling a little bit. I've got them at 64.7 plays, one of the more up-tempo teams. You've got them at 63.3. It's it's somewhat tough to figure because we both have them running at a pretty high rate, relative to average. I've got them at a 57.5% pass rate. You've got them even lower at 55.5%. Generally, a lower pass rate is lower plays per game. But I know Thorman had Colts as first in situation neutral pace, first in no huddle rate during the games that they had Richardson. And they were producing a lot of points, a lot of plays. So that's part of the reason why we're a little bit more aggressive on the play count for Indy right now.
That's interesting. I would want to talk to him about that. I'm looking at the spreadsheet that you make for me. And so the first week they ran 69 plays and Richardson played that whole game, which is above average and was fast paced. And they threw at a decent clip. The second week when he got hurt, they were also so they threw at actually a high clip, 68%. The next week they were at 62.5% pass rate, which was actually a plus PROE. Week 1, their PROE was neutral. They had a high expected pass rate, but their play volume had come down a little bit. It was only 56 total plays in week 2. He missed week 3 and they ran 84 plays in week 3, which is a game that Minshew played, if I'm not mistaken. And then the next 2 games, he was the starter. They ran 58 and 61 plays based on what I'm seeing. So my take is the part of the reason I'm lower on the play volume is my take was that, okay, they went aggressive with Richardson in week 1, and then he got hurt in week 2. And then in week 3, when he came back, they actually pulled him back a little bit. They had a negative 21% pass rate over expected in that week 4 game where Richardson started and played the whole game against the Rams. Mm-hmm. They went into overtime and only threw 25 passes in the entire game. And then the next week, week 5, Richardson gets injured, but they also have a pretty heavy negative pass rate over expected, negative 12. The game plan seemed to be very run heavy again in that one, 61 plays in that one. So in 3 of the 4 games that he played in, and in the 2 games he left early, he left in after just like a third of the game. So really he winds up playing 2 full games and 2 thirds. But 3 of the 4 games, including the 2 that he left early, they run 61 or fewer plays. And the only one that they were above average in pace by what I'm looking at was week 1. And that concerns me. That's digging into the hyper, go ahead.
That's where it's hard to kind of tangle the intent and also like the impact of like running at a high rate has on it. So where Thorman's coming from, if you look, this is from True Media data, but in like neutral situations, the 4 games that Richardson played, the average play clock at the time of snap was 13.8 seconds, 13.4 seconds, 15.9 seconds, and 10.4. So an average of 13.4. The fastest team in the league last year over the season was Dallas with an average play clock in neutral situation of 12.4 seconds. So he's looking at that intent, I guess, of like they're snapping the ball very early on.
I did note that the pace should stay high, but run rate increasing means fewer total plays, which you sort of went into. And so if you get into these, and so I get Thorman's point now, especially when you talk about, like I mentioned the negative 21% PROE. They're not going to carry that over a full season. The reason that the week 4 game where Richardson played the whole game led to lower play volume is it was such an extreme run heavy game plan in that one. They will throw more at times, But it is really interesting to think through because Steichen does have this background of a fast pace, and it's been referenced a lot. In Justin Herbert's rookie season, he was the OC with the Chargers. They were really above average in play volume. They were solid in Philly, but I think his first year there, their play volume wasn't great. Again, it gets back to the run heaviness and pace, the difference between play volume and pace.
Mm-hmm.
Storman is the absolute goat on this stuff. That's why I was asking the questions, because you trust him over me every day of the week and twice on Sunday. But my concern is that they could get into a place where Steichen is. Did you have the weekly numbers there? Were they still snapping quickly in weeks 4 and 5? Or was that overall?
So week 4 was very quick. It was the
quick.
quickest that they had. Week 5 was a little bit more normal.
Run heavy, but quick. Yeah. So that's interesting. That changes my take a little bit. My worry was that they might be going from Steichen fast-paced offense to Steichen kind of trying to hide Anthony Richardson as a passer offense right away when he came back. But it's such a small sample. It's really hard to parse.
It's hard both ways, too. It's really – and again, it's like – you're going to end up, the more you increase the pass rate, the more you're going to increase the plays per game, regardless of how you feel about the pace, and so you've got 2 points lower pass rate. So it's going to make sense. Our gap probably is wider than it should be, but it still makes sense that you're going to be lower on plays if you're lower on pass rate. That's very correlated. So, and that's where I really don't know what they're going to do in terms of pass rate. We had 57.5%, don't have a ton of confidence in it. If we went down to 55.5%, the play count would come down a little bit.
And I did actually bump the play count a half a play per game, I think, after I copied this over, because I was having this conversation on my last stream with my buddy Jacob Sanderson, who's an Indianapolis Colts fan as well and is really high on Richardson. He got me moving that direction. I might even have to go up a little higher, but that's where – so my Richardson projection comes out lower than I'm sort of comfortable with, and that's where, I was excited to talk with you about him, because I think the fantasy community to some degree is really focused on sometimes just like one issue. And it's like, okay, well, Anthony Richardson, he's got this mobility. He had 4 rushing TDs and rushing efficiency in those 2 2/3 games. And it's like, if he rushes anywhere close to that, this guy's just an absolute superstar, right? 4 rush TDs, barely even played last year. But also you have to have some passing numbers. Like back in the day when like Tim Tebow and Terrell Pryor and those guys, when Rich Rebar was first writing about the Konami code, were the big rushing quarterbacks, they had a certain ceiling because they didn't throw for 4,000 yards, right? They actually didn't have much in the way of passing numbers. You do have to have some type of passing numbers. And Jacob mentioned to me, look, when Lamar had his great season, he didn't even throw for 4,000 yards, but we talked about how his pass TD rate was astronomical, 9% pass TD rate that year. And also he ran for 1,000+ yards, 1,200 yards, I think it was. I'm projecting Richardson for about 660 yards rushing, which is solid, but he also got hurt twice last year in 4 games, including on a run, scoring in the end zone, kind of welcomed a hit as he crossed the goal line that I think he could have avoided, took a concussion. I think that's part of why they were a little careful with him when he came back, and then he got hurt again. And so I look at it from scramble rate and design run rate. His scramble rate I have right in line with the other mobile quarterbacks around the league. His designed run rate is the interesting element and his scramble rate probably wouldn't be high. He doesn't take a lot of sacks either. He tends to get the ball out actually as a passer, which is good. Well, not necessarily. I mean, it's good if he scrambles as well, but the design rate is the interesting one. How many design runs are they going to call for him when he had multiple injuries quick, and they need him healthy this year? This is the year where in year 2, you can't have him get hurt again in year 2 and not know what he is long-term. You're building your team around this guy. And then you signed Jonathan Taylor in season last year to the big deal, and you have him there. So I'm projecting a ton of rush work for Jonathan Taylor. I think we're going run heavy. We're using Richardson's threat of the run to mostly run Taylor, a lot of Taylor. Jacob brought up on some of those Lamar teams how Gus Edwards, especially in close, would get a lot of the rush TDs. Lamar's never had more than 7 rush TDs. So the rush TDs become an interesting part of this as well with the design run rate, because a lot of the design runs can come in close, and those are the important design runs. So Jalen Hurts has a high design run rate. Josh Allen, high design run rate. Those guys both had 15 rush TDs last year. Where I could be wrong in my projection on Richardson is if he actually gets all these goal line rushes. And we talked about this a little before the stream. I'm having a really hard time figuring it out because I don't think they're going to call a ton of, goal line rushes for him based on some of the injury stuff, maybe on like a third down, but it's like first and second down, give it to Taylor. And then maybe we pull and have Richardson go. But if Taylor scores on first or second down, like it's just Taylor, right? And I think Taylor's very talented. So we were talking about the rush TDs. I have Taylor meaningfully ahead of you guys. You guys have Richardson meaningfully ahead of me. I think that's a big part of the Richardson profile this year is whether the rush TDs are actually in the, can get to the Allen and Jalen Hurts sphere.
Yeah. And I'm pretty bullish there. I guess I'm less concerned about them totally like changing what they're doing because of the injuries last year. And that's where, it comes down to, because at his size, like this is a Josh Allen sized quarterback. It's not a Lamar Jackson sized quarterback. Richardson's 6'4", 244. That's very similar to Allen's build. And I feel like if you're drafting this guy where they took him, 4th overall, you're accepting the type of player that you have and build, and you have to like accentuate this player's strengths. And I think that's going to be, and I think of Josh Allen early in his career when he wasn't a very good passer, he was always such a great red zone threat because of his size and his ability down by the goal line. That I think we see that with Richardson. Obviously a small sample size last year, but like he did have 4 rushing touchdowns in 4 games, so like when you're looking at the projection and where it could be wrong, maybe like 6 is like the right median, but like it's going to be hard for him to have much less than 6, and it's going to be not too hard for him to have a lot more than 6 if it breaks right, is sort of the way that I'm looking at it. And then of course, some discrepancy in terms of our called run plays per game too, though, which doesn't funnel to Richardson as much, but does funnel to Jonathan Taylor. You've got him at 299 carries. We're at 262. That's a very big discrepancy. We have Richardson, again, because it's correlated, we have Richardson taking some goal line touchdowns. So we have JT at 8. You have him at 11.4. So it does funnel down. I think in general, we're a little bit probably more conservative on the running back touchdowns as well. I just know.
Well, so one of the issues I ran into with Richardson, and you guys might be running into here, is when you try to push a lot of TDs towards him, you get above the market's expectation for touchdowns for this offense, which is not particularly high. It's a little bit below average. And so, I'm projecting a little bit more than 20 rush TDs and only 21 pass TDs. I'm intrigued to see that you guys are actually a little lower than me in the pass TDs, because this is my lowest pass TDs by a lot of any team that I've projected so far, so that I could project a higher rush TD rate. I do think that means, or that's fair, because like Steichen comes over from the Eagles where they run for a lot in close. And I do think Richardson and Taylor as like a read option thing is just a dynamic way of playing in the red zone. And they're probably going to leverage that as much as they can. I just think they're going to give to Taylor more than Richardson. You know what I mean? Like, but that's a really precise, and I don't want to be wrong on the precision element of it, because Richardson's profile can obviously smash. But what's interesting is that we both have really low pass numbers for him. If Richardson doesn't actually smash as a runner, like he's overpriced at that point. He has to smash at a runner just to get to his price. And I don't really see where he's like the QB1 overall, unless the Colts are way better than market expectation and he throws more TDs than this. Because when Lamar did it, he threw 36 touchdowns. We're both projecting Richardson at 20 to 21 pass TDs. He's got to get to 30 pass TDs in addition to a really strong rush season. We love this type of profile for fantasy, but I do wonder if, to steal a line for you, we're jumping the shark a little bit on this is not a team that the market loves a ton. And how do you project enough touchdowns? And where you guys have the Richardson rush TDs, then you have to take it off of Jonathan Taylor, because, I mean, there's only so many touchdowns that can be projected for this offense unless you think the Colts are going to have a monster year, which is one take, certainly.
Yeah, we have them about 2.5 offensive TDs per game, which is slightly high relative to the Vegas odds, but not like crazy high. Their average team total is about 22.5. That's the one we're using, which is kind of a mixture of the regular season and the playoffs in order to weight those playoff weeks a little bit more. In terms of rushing touchdowns, we do have Richardson projected for the 4th most rushing touchdowns in the league And then we have Jonathan Taylor projected for the 10th most. So we do have a lot of rushing touchdowns.
And I have Taylor projected for about 5 more than Richardson. You guys have Richardson for more than Taylor, which is that again, that's a really intriguing question there. Because I mean, I feel pretty confident Taylor's going to have more than Richardson. Actually, I feel that's not a take that I would back off of easily. I don't think.
I have to think about that one. We'll probably end up evening them out at 8.5, but I don't know. I think I'd take Richardson rushing touchdowns straight up.
Interesting.
But that's that's obviously the crux of it. Is he more like Lamar in the rushing touchdown department, or is he more like Hurts and Allen? Is sort of the name of the game. And it's difficult. We could see a big efficiency number out of Jonathan Taylor playing with the mobile quarterback. A lot of that read option stuff. Curious, because we're pretty behind market on Taylor. So I'm wondering, like, if you're drafting him right now in that window where it's a lot of opportunity cost relative to the wide receivers in like early mid-second round.
I've taken a decent amount of him. I'm underweight on him because of the structural stuff and because I have a major concerns about where his receiving can come in. So you really have to have a monster rushing line. I have to be really right on all the rushing stuff. But he does look good. I just did this projection recently, and since doing it, I wound up higher on Taylor and more comfortable with the upside bull case for Taylor, I think. But I always love to talk about the high value touches, which is the touchdown equity, which I'm excited about, plus the receiving. And I'm not excited about the receiving. I don't think there's going to be a ton of dump offs from Richardson in this offense. I've got him for 30 catches. You guys have him a little higher at 32. Usually I come in hot on that side. So it's nice to see. I'm glad to see you guys are a little higher than me, even so I can maybe bump that up a little. Because I do really like Taylor and want to be in on him. That's the side of it that's tricky is the targets and the receptions. And the structural stuff.
Yeah. Are you taking any Trey Sermon or Evan Hall?
I just started taking some Sermon after this projection. Really, I'm like, man, I did a little research. He looks like he's going to be the number 2. And we are talking about this really run heavy offense. If Taylor misses time, like I think Richardson impacts the efficiency of the runners, of the running backs, which we know mobile quarterbacks tend to do in these types of offenses. I don't think Trey Sermon's particularly great, but I think you put him in a Shane Steichen scheme and you have Anthony Richardson as a threat. He probably runs pretty efficiently. If he's going to be the legit number 2, which it sounds like that's where we're headed. Is that what you guys are hearing?
We are, but we're still skeptical. Like,
yeah,
it sounds like he's the front runner right now, but his history is obviously quite poor. So we're just not sure.
Yeah.
It's hard to take a handcuff when you're not sure. So it's like,
right.
I think like on the DK FFPC drafts where you're like 20 rounds, like you start getting into rounds 19, 20. But I don't think I'm at the point where I'm taking them in underdog 18 round drafts yet.
And I think that's fair. I think actually where I've taken a decent amount of him, a couple of shares, is in my slow drafts for the puppy super flex over on underdog, also 20 rounds. A few more quarterbacks get drafted, but you get deeper into running back. And that's where I'm like, all right, I'll start thinking of Trey Sermon when like Audric Estime is already gone and you're getting kind of deep,
Let's go to receiver. The top 2 were pretty similar on. We each have like around 140 targets for Pittman, around 90 targets for Josh Downs. That equates to about 220, 225 PPR points for Pittman, around 145 for Josh Downs. I know for us at those markers, we're a little bit behind on Pittman positionally. Not a ton, but like a little bit. And then just have Downs as like the strongest value of the bunch. Not like a smash or anything, but the best of the wide receiver values. We'll get to Mitchell versus Pierce in a second, because that's one where we differ, but we're pretty close, at least from a projection standpoint, on Pittman and Downs.
Yeah, I mean, so I wrote a little bit last offseason about the RPO stuff and how that can create a higher target share for wide receiver ones because it's either going to be a run or it's going to be a pass to the wide receiver one because the linemen are run blocking and it becomes an ineligible downfield if the quarterback gets through too much in his progression. He needs to either hand the ball off or pull and throw. And that leads to then every attempt off of RPOs tending to go to the first read leads to higher target shares. It shows this in the data for the number ones. The Colts were second in the NFL in passes off of RPOs last year, even with Minshew playing a lot. So I think that helped Pittman's target share quite a bit, and I think it's insulated for those reasons because the Eagles have been high in RPOs for many years, including when Steichen was there. Downs earned volume well outside the first read stuff and was exciting for that reason. I think, we can talk about Mitchell and Pierce in a moment, but I do think Pittman is sort of insulated because of those RPO first read stuff. At the same time, he's gotten so pricey because Minshew played most of the season last year. He was way cheaper last year because Richardson was taking over this offense. It's going to be run heavy, not as much passing. And then he has a really strong year with Minshew. And to the point of, I was talking a little bit about a little bit lower play volume, not pace, but play volume and pass attempts in Richardson's games. It was a lot higher in the Minshew games, more play volume, more pass attempts in those games. That's just not the way you project this offense this year. So Pittman being a third round pick and an offense that just doesn't project we both have them not just below 4,000 passing yards, but below 3,700, like very, very low. It's even with the insulated target share I was talking about, even with the concentrated volume that we're both giving him. And I'm definitely giving Pittman. He doesn't look like the right pick at that cost.
Yeah, he's probably a guy that I'll be underweight, but not like full fading in best ball at this point, and probably someone I'm less in redraft leagues where he might be a full fade for me there. So Adonai Mitchell versus Alec Pierce. Mitchell, the rookie. This is one where we've really struggled to get Mitchell like to a draftable spot on ADP, even kind of like fudging his upside case, unless he really ices Pierce like from the get-go. You've got Mitchell at 80 targets, Pierce at 16. Combined, we're very similar on targets, but we've got about 20 less for Mitchell, him at 60, and Pierce more at 40. So this has been a difficult one for us to dissect because we don't want to, it sounds silly to not take an exciting rookie because of Alec Pierce, but at the same time, we're trying to be somewhat grounded in it. So yeah, definitely curious your thoughts on the competition there for that boundary receiver.
I think it's a fair concern and consideration. Pierce, as a rookie, 15.9% targets per out run at a 12.2% ADOT, which is closer to average. Last year was way up to a 15.7% ADOT, pure deep threat, and fell all the way to a 10.4% targets per out run. Very, very low number. They kind of just turned him into a wind sprinter, sub 1 yards per out run last year. Ran a ton of routes, 605 routes, like a lot of routes to just be completely out of the offense this year. But I think whatever they had with him or thought they had with him last year, and Steichen in particular taking over, then going out and getting Mitchell, to me, is just like an admission that they don't think Pierce is it. That's the way I'm projecting it, obviously, because I have Pierce for only 16 targets. So interesting, your guys' take on Pierce at least being involved, because obviously the pricing is not that way. Mitchell's the one that I draft the most of because Downs is a little bit more of a lower ADOT guy. If Mitchell gets that vertical roll, that's the one thing with the lower pass volume that can still hit a little bit. Is Richardson is a good downfield passer. He's mobile. He can extend plays. He could probably hit for some deep shots, and you can see some spike weeks. If I'm taking some Richardson teams, Mitchell's the guy I like to stack him with the most because of the high ADOT stuff. But if Pierce is playing more, like you guys have it, then that's certainly tricky.
Yeah. And again, we don't have Pierce as like someone you should be drafting. It just cuts into Mitchell enough where I struggle to take Mitchell, a full round ahead of Josh Downs as like a pretty solid year two player. That's a very heavy favorite to see more targets, even though, to your point, the efficiency spike isn't going to be as good. So I've only drafted Mitchell thus far on Richardson teams because we're quite a bit behind ADP. So that one's tricky for me. I feel confident that I think Downs is the better pick at cost than Mitchell, but we might be a little too harsh on Mitchell right now. Another guy that I've seen people draft that we're really low on, but at tight end is people like kind of tacking on Jelani Woods as a late round tight end. We're probably too low on his targets. We have Granson ahead right now with 36 targets to Jelani's 21. You've got Granson at 30, Jelani at 33. These are very low target numbers, no matter who's that you're using, because we kind of have it split. Jelani's the guy that's got certainly a bit more juice to him if he was to see volume, but anything, are you drafting Jelani late at all?
The guy that's tricky here for me is not so much Granson, but it's Will Mallory, who actually had a mildly intriguing rookie season last year on a limited number of routes. But like, that's the problem. They ran a bunch of different dudes in routes. They had one game I remember from Stealing Signals where I think 3 guys had they had a routes per dropback rate of 25%, and the fourth was 27%. And it's like, I've never seen anything like it at tight end, to have 4 guys be so evenly split. That didn't include Jelani, who was hurt. It included Drew Ogletree, whatever the Ogletree. I
think that's right. I think it's like Andrew Ogletree.
Okay.
So if you're close, you want to call him Drew, that's fine.
Yeah.
He's Drew on Colts.com. So
there you go. Kylan Granson ran the most routes last year. Mallory was a little better targets per route run. Jelani's 2022 was more similar to Mallory's 2023. Mo Alley Cox is easily cuttable up until week 1, and he's expensive and doesn't have any guaranteed money. And I kind of think they're just holding him to see if Jelani Woods is healthy, because they have like 7 tight ends still on the roster. I kind of think this is the year where Mo Alley Cox actually gets cut, because they do have Granson, Mallory, and Jelani. And again, he costs them like $8 million, and none of it's guaranteed, so they don't have to cut him yet, and they might later. But yeah, the whole thing is tricky. I'm projecting Granson, Woods, and Mallory to all have between 30 and 33 targets. Like, it's going to be very split, I think.
Yeah, we're pretty aligned there. All right, that's going to do it for us on the second episode of the offseason projection special. Thanks again to Gretch for doing these with us. Make sure you check him out, bengretch.substack.com, and his podcast with Sean Siegel, Stealing Bananas. You find all my work at Establish the Run. And if you're listening, please give us a like, subscribe, whether it's on the podcast feed or on the Establish the Edge YouTube channel. Thanks so much, everybody.